Hey everyone, let's talk about Bitcoin mining. I have avoided doing this video because it's hard. It's complicated, it's hard, it's full of numbers, and it's an advanced video, which means most people won't watch it. But I got to do it sometime, so I'm just going to try to knock it out right now and hope for the best. Okay, so the process of Bitcoin mining is how Bitcoin come into existence. The Bitcoin mining computers secure and audit the Bitcoin network, and in exchange, they get a small amount of new Bitcoin as a result. In the early days, it was more Bitcoin. It was 50 Bitcoin, 50, every 10 minutes. Then after 4 years, in 2012, it dropped to 25 Bitcoin. Then 4 years later, in 2020, it dropped to 6.25 Bitcoin. And now in 2024, on April 19th, it dropped to 3.125 Bitcoin. So right now, about every 10 minutes, somebody on the Bitcoin network mines the next block, which means they solve the next block of transactions and mint it to the Bitcoin network and get 3.125 Bitcoin as a result of their efforts. And that happens about every 10 minutes. Every 4 years, that number will drop until it drops in half 32 times. Once it drops in half 32 times, it rounds down to zero, and that is why there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. That is how that process works. Okay, so the purpose of Bitcoin mining is to secure and audit the Bitcoin network. The reward for Bitcoin mining is two things. One, it is the block reward, which is the 3.125 Bitcoin that you get for whoever solves the block. Whoever solves the block gets 3.125 Bitcoin, and you get the transaction fees that are in that block. So in order to transact on the Bitcoin network, you have to include a transaction fee. In the last week or so, most of those transaction fees have been around between $1 and $2. So you can transact an unlimited amount of money, $1 billion, but the fee to include it on the Bitcoin network, which means to transact on the Bitcoin network, is between $1 and $2 for the last week or two. Okay, so what does a Bitcoin mining computer look like? Well, just so I could do this video, I went online and I bought this Bidax personalized Bitcoin miner. This little puppy here, I tried to take it apart, but I didn't want to break it. But anyway, underneath this huge heat sink, which is right here, it's a big old fan, there's a chip. Underneath there is a chip that is the very latest generation of Bitcoin mining chips. This little thing cost me $200, $200. So $200, and it comes with this big old power adapter that uses, I don't know how much electricity it uses, but something like just leaving a light, just a light on all the time. I don't know how many watts it is, but anyway, it's not, this is a tiny one, so it doesn't use a lot of electricity. Now, this little guy can process more than 1 trillion transactions, or I should say, it can solve 1 trillion guesses to try to solve the next block a second. So when I plug this thing in, every single second, it processes 1 trillion computations to try to figure out what the next block is. Now, the question is, if this little guy is processing 1 trillion transactions every single second, why am I not going to mine a block probably ever? The answer is the total Bitcoin network is made up of more than 1 billion of these things that are running 1 trillion computations a second. So the total hash rate, which is the measure of the security and auditing of a blockchain, the total hash rate is almost 1,000 exahashes, which is 1,000 billion trillion. That means every second on the Bitcoin network, a billion trillion transactions are being processed every second. And with that many billion trillion transactions per second, someone finds a Bitcoin block about every 10 minutes. That means about every 10 minutes, which is 600 minutes, I believe it's some number of either sextillion or septillion number of, I used to know the number, but how many guesses go in before somebody mines a block is somewhere up in the septillion or sextillion total. But for easy numbers to remember, this thing can do 1 trillion transactions a second, and there are more than 1 billion of these doing 1 trillion transactions a second on the Bitcoin network. Now, should you buy one of these? The answer is no. You will never make any money on this, and I will never make any money on this, and I will explain why in a second here. Let me get a drink here. Okay, so the problem is This thing cost me $200. The also problem is the total Bitcoin network is made up of more than 1 billion of these, meaning my chances of mining a Bitcoin block every 10 minutes are roughly 1 in 1 billion. So I asked ChatGPT, because I was curious, I asked ChatGPT, I plugged in, which ChatGPT is amazing if you haven't used it. I plugged it all in and I said, I paid $200 for this. Would I be better off? Am I more likely to make money spending $200 on this and running it for a year, or buying $200 of lottery tickets? And ChatGPT told me I am 16,000% more likely to make money on lottery tickets as opposed to Bitcoin mining. What that means is even with the very latest chip, there's no way an average individual person like me is going to ever make money on this thing. My chances every 10 minutes are about 1 in a billion. My chances every year are about 1 in 10,000. So if I ran this, I would on average mine a Bitcoin block at the current difficulty level once every 10,000 years. So therefore, it is not economical to own one of these. And the way you can benefit from Bitcoin is buying Bitcoin, like actually buying Bitcoin. Trying to mine it yourself makes no sense because this thing is only going to mine you a block of Bitcoin every 10,000 years. And in 116 years from now, there won't be any block reward and you'll just have transaction fees. And the likelihood that you'll make any money based on the electricity you have used is basically zero. Okay. So how does the Bitcoin network work with all these things mining? Well, when the Bitcoin network was first launched and the very first block was mined and minted, and it had in it hard-coded in that block, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout. It said Times of London, January 3rd, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout. So it was a message embedded in the very original Bitcoin block indicating that the reason that Satoshi Nakamoto was inventing Bitcoin was he was sick of all the government money printing. He was sick of the debasing of the currency, meaning the dilution of money. And so he took the Times of London, their main newspaper like the New York Times, but Times of London. He took the January 3rd edition of 2009 and he embedded that headline into the very first block of Bitcoin. He also did that so that he could prove that he had not invented it, or at least had not launched the Bitcoin network prior to January 3rd of 2009, because obviously nobody would have known what the headline was going to be in the newspaper on the Times of London, January 3rd, 2009, until it actually happened. So when it was originally set up, the Bitcoin network, give me 1 second. It was set up where you could mine a Bitcoin block with 50 Bitcoin in it every 4.3 billion tries, which means this little guy would have mined billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin in 7 seconds. But they didn't have these back then. So the very first block required you to guess, to try to solve the computationally complex algorithm 4.3 billion times. And the reason it was set that way is at the time, based on the computers people had, it was estimated it would take about 10 minutes with the computers they had in 2009. With all the computers that were on the Bitcoin network or likely to join at the early stages of the Bitcoin network, it would take about 10 minutes. If all the computers were working very hard, they would eventually guess about 4.3 billion tries, and then somebody would mine the Bitcoin block. But it gets more complicated because the Bitcoin network has what's called a difficulty adjustment. So the difficulty adjustment means every 2016 blocks, the network detects how long it took to mine those 2016 blocks, which is 2 weeks. So it's 10 minutes times 2016 is 2 weeks, or 2 weeks divided by 10 minutes is 2016. So every 2016, which happens to also be the inverse of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102. 6102 is the reverse of 2016. So that was the executive order where in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt forced everyone to give up their gold and turn it over to the U.S. government. So some people hypothesize that the reason Satoshi Nakamoto used 2016 blocks is because it's a mirror inverse of 6102, which is Executive Order 6102, which he would have known was the executive order where gold, the former form of hard money, sound money, was taken away from the American people. So every 2016 blocks, the Bitcoin network detects how many computers are trying to solve these mathematical equations, and it makes it harder or easier. So let's use it in, this is oversimplified. So just FYI, this is oversimplified. So let's say the Bitcoin network launches and it says, and basically the Bitcoin network says, hey, you have to run this algorithm. Now the algorithm back then that it was running, which is the same one right now, is called SHA-256, SHA-256. And it's, I forget, it's a complicated series of words, but the acronym is SHA-256, and it is pronounced SHA-256. So you have to run the SHA-256 algorithm. One second. Okay, so we're gonna hypothesize that Sudoku is the equivalent, because it's just something that's easier for humans to understand. So the original Bitcoin network said basically, look, everybody, you do your Sudoku puzzles, and at the end of every Sudoku puzzle, it spits out a random number that's based on the puzzle you did, and we're going to see if that number is the right number out of 4.3 billion. And if you do enough Sudoku puzzles about every 10 minutes, one of these SHA-256 algorithms would spit out the right number, and it would result in somebody getting the block. Well, then it got more difficult. So initially it was, you have to guess the number out of 4.3 billion. And then again, I'm oversimplifying this, but now you have to guess the right number out of 7 billion. Now out of 12 billion, now out of 15 billion. Well, now it's like some insane number. It's basically like trying to guess a number out of, 2.3 septillion or something. It's just like, it's some huge, it's roughly 1 billion times 1 trillion times 600. So let's call it 600 billion trillion is roughly the number of times you have to guess to get a block, because that is 600 minutes of something like this running 1 trillion guesses a second times about 1 billion of these that are currently running in the world, securing and auditing the Bitcoin network. So if you want to know a sort of how much computational power is securing and auditing the Bitcoin network, it is 600 billion trillion. And then at 600 billion trillion, about every 10 minutes, somebody guesses a block. But that number is actually getting harder, because every time somebody adds something like this to the network, it finds blocks slightly faster. So as it finds blocks slightly faster, every 2 weeks, every 216 blocks, the difficulty adjustment's going to update, and it's going to say, you're finding blocks about every 9 minutes. I need to make the difficulty adjustment, 11% harder to get you back up to 10 minutes. And vice versa. If computing power comes off the network, then the same thing happens. It lowers the difficulty adjustment and makes it easier. So that is how a Bitcoin block is mined. So a couple of questions come to mind on that. One is, I'll go into a little bit more detail on what the actual miners are doing. So what this little guy is doing is he is connecting to my Bitcoin node. You do not need a Bitcoin node, but I happen to have a Bitcoin node because it's techie and it's cool. But anyway, this little guy connects to my Bitcoin node. My Bitcoin node already has the entire Bitcoin blockchain. Every transaction that has ever happened is already on it. Again, the average person does not need this, but it's cool. Just, it's pretty easy to actually have your own Bitcoin node. But there's no benefit to the average person in most situations. So this goes, it figures out from the Bitcoin node what the most recent block is. Let's say the most recent block is 890,000. I don't know. It's somewhere in that ballpark. So it says, okay, what are all the transactions that are bidding the highest transaction rate to get in the next block? And then it takes a group of a few thousand of those. It can't exceed, the technological limit is 1 megabyte, although they found ways to get that about 3 or 4 megabytes. But anyway, it rounds up as big a group of transactions as it can legally fit in the next block, which has a limit. And then it takes the hash, which is the magic answer of the previous block. It adds the hash plus all the new transactions plus a random number, and then it runs the SHA-256 algorithm on it, and then it checks with the Bitcoin network to see if its guess is close enough to mine the next block. And this thing has the ability to do that a trillion times a second. It takes a group of transactions, it combines it with the hash of the previous block, it combines it with a random number, and it runs the SHA-256 hashing algorithm, and then it checks with the Bitcoin network to see if it was close enough to the target of the number you have to guess to solve the block in order to mine the block. And if it is, then the entire Bitcoin network credits this little Bitcoin miner with 3.125 Bitcoin plus the transaction fees of whatever was in the block it mined. And that happens again. Somebody's going to win that about every 10 minutes. The probability this one gets it is one every 10,000 years. So, but again, that's why the people who make money in Bitcoin mining are running massive mega data centers coming off of hydroelectric power or wind or solar or nuclear. There's no way you can make money in Bitcoin mining unless you have a massive data center of Bitcoin mining hardware and you have access to extremely cheap electricity. And I don't have either one of those, which is why I'm not mining Bitcoin and why you do not need to worry about this. And again, I bought this as a novelty because, as I said earlier in the video, ChatGPT says I'm 16,000% more likely to make money just with lottery tickets. According to ChatGPT, if I buy $200 of lottery tickets, on average, I'll have $32 of winnings. And according to ChatGPT, out of $200 of lottery tickets, $32 of winnings is 16,000% better on an annual basis than I'm likely to get with this little guy. So this is not a way to make money. It's just a novelty. Although there are people that have massive data centers of these that actually do make money, but they have access to very cheap electricity and huge economies of scale. All right, so a couple last things I wanted to answer is, in order to, so with that much computing power, someone would have to compete with that computing power to try to compromise the Bitcoin network in any way, and which is completely impossible because the total aggregate hash rate, which is securing and auditing the Bitcoin network, far exceeds anything else on the planet. So there's literally no conceivable way you can compete with the securing and auditing of the Bitcoin network, because the Bitcoin network has more computing power and electricity usage than anything in the entire world that could possibly compete with it, including all the countries and governments of the world ganging up on it. There's not enough computing power or electricity available in the world to compete to try to compromise the Bitcoin network. So it is the most secure network that humans have ever created in the world. Also, you're probably wondering, well, wait, if it's so hard to solve the next block, why don't I work on the block after the next block, and then I can work on that one for 20 minutes instead of 10 minutes and double my chances? The answer is you can't do that because every block has to have the hash of the previous block embedded in it. Meaning nobody can start working on the block after the current block until someone solves the current block. Because if you don't solve the current block, then the marketplace, then the Bitcoin network doesn't know what the hash of the current block is. And if you don't have the hash of the current block, you can't start working on the next block. So the only block that anyone can work on is the current one that has not yet been solved, because the one after that, you can't start working on it until you have the hash of the current block to include in it. So that is the way that the Bitcoin networks keeps anyone from trying to work ahead or cheat. So we've covered in this, the purpose of Bitcoin mining is to secure and audit the Bitcoin network. That is done with things that look like this, although they don't have the blue cover on them. They just look like chip circuit boards. That securing and auditing is done by things like this. This chip can run the SHA-256 hashing algorithm 1 trillion times a second. The total hash rate on the Bitcoin network is made up of more than 1 billion of these, which means my chances of mining a Bitcoin block are 1 in a billion every 10 minutes, which I think is in the ballpark of maybe I mine a block once every 10,000 years, which means, again, lottery tickets are a 16,000% better return. And I don't buy lottery tickets. I buy Bitcoin. So that is how the Bitcoin network works. With that kind of hashing power, you can be absolutely assured that any money stored in the Bitcoin network, any value stored, is secure, because there is not enough computing power or electricity in the world to attack or try to compromise the Bitcoin network, because the Bitcoin network far exceeds computing power and electricity use of anything that could possibly attack it. So it's the most secure network that humans have ever created. We covered the difficulty adjustment, where as things get added to the network, it gets more difficult. As they get subtracted from the network, it gets easier, thereby making sure that no matter how many computers are working on solving the blocks on the Bitcoin network, there is a new block generated about every 10 minutes, even though that goes up and down. Sometimes people get lucky and it's less than 10 minutes. Sometimes they're trending a little less lucky and it takes a little more than 10 minutes. But the Bitcoin network, every 2 weeks, every 2016 blocks, 2016, is updating that difficulty to reflect how much computing power is on the Bitcoin network. If you want to see all of this happening in real time, the best website is mempool.space. That's mempool.space. That website again is mempool.space, mempool.space. That's the entire web address. The dot space is the equivalent of the .com. So there's no .com, .net, .org. It's just mempool.space. And that will show you on the top the Bitcoin network. It'll show you the block that is being worked on, which is the one immediately to the left of the divider, is the block that's being worked on. And it'll show you, if you scroll down, exactly what's in it. It'll also show you on mempool.space the difficulty adjustment and the anticipated upcoming adjustment of how much harder the Bitcoin network is going to make the hashing in the next upcoming difficulty adjustment. So anyway, all of that is super cool. It's amazing that this can run a trillion SHA-256 computations a second. The fact that any computing device can run a trillion of any very difficult computing algorithm a second is amazing. And it's even more amazing that the Bitcoin network is secured by more than 1 billion of these, which is more computing power than humans have ever assembled for anything else in the world, and more powerful than all of the supercomputers in the world combined, thereby making the Bitcoin network the most secure network that has ever existed in the world. So I have oversimplified this. That is a caveat. So, for example, the difficulty adjustment, the way it targets the guessing is more complicated than what I explained. I'm happy to explain that in a more technical video if anybody wants to know, but it gets super technical how that exactly works. I could go into how the SHA-256 hashing algorithm works. But what's important is that your Bitcoin is super secure. And it's extremely audited, it is extremely secure, and that it's got the amount of computational power guaranteeing the security and auditing of your Bitcoin is beyond anything that humans have ever fathomed in the entirety of the human race. One last thing I'll say is the reason Bitcoin is so secure is any other coin, if somebody wanted to try to compete with Bitcoin, they would have to outpace Bitcoin's hash rate in order to create something that is secure, because otherwise Bitcoin's hash rate could be pointed towards some other currency to try to compromise it if it's small. That can't happen with Bitcoin. The analogy I used previously is imagine that you're trying to dilute something, and Bitcoin is the equivalent to the ocean. If somebody's like, we're going to compromise the ocean by diluting it, the answer is no, you're not. There's nowhere you can get water that is going in aggregate to dilute the ocean. Now, vice versa, somebody starts a worthless little currency the size of the lake that is in my neighborhood and says, hey, nobody can dilute us. The answer is everybody can dilute you. I can go pump water from the ocean and dilute it all day long. So that's the way Bitcoin works as well, is Bitcoin is the dominant computer network, which means it can't be compromised because it's the equivalent of trying to, drain the ocean or boil the ocean or dilute the ocean. You can't, because it's the largest body of water. And by definition, the largest body of water cannot be diluted because all of the other bodies of water are smaller. The reverse is not true. The ocean absolutely can dilute anything smaller than the ocean, because ocean water can be pumped in to dilute anything else, if that's what you were trying to do. And that is why Bitcoin is far more secure, and why things like Dogecoin and Shiba Inu and these other things will never be secure, because they are a tiny fraction of the size of the Bitcoin network. And if somebody wanted to, they could easily compromise those networks. It's just something like Dogecoin. Nobody's bothered to do it because it's a waste of time. But I would never keep any meaningful wealth in something like Dogecoin, where that network could easily be overrun by a fraction of the Bitcoin network if anybody ever decided to do that. That could never happen with the Bitcoin network, because again, the Bitcoin network is the equivalent of the ocean. It's bigger than all other bodies of water by a million X, and therefore there's no way to dilute the ocean or siphon all the water of the ocean off or boil the ocean, because it's the big one. So anyway, hope all that helps. And if you got any questions, let me know. This is an advanced video, so hopefully, it's not applicable to the vast majority of people. But I thought this little Bitcoin miner, I thought it was pretty cool that it could do 1 trillion. I thought it was pretty cool that even though it could do 1 trillion computations a second, I'm still better off buying lottery tickets, which I will not do and have never done. But it's just pretty cool that the Bitcoin network is so powerful that even though this thing can do 1 trillion computations a second, it's competing with 1 billion of these around the world, securing and auditing the network, and therefore this little guy doesn't stand a chance. So at some point, I'll probably leave him plugged in because, even 1 in a billion chance every 10 minutes is not nothing, but the probability I'll make money is 0. I mean, literally, I'm likely to make money with this little guy once every 10,000 years, and that's ridiculously small odds. So anyway, have a great day, everyone. That's your, brief, ultra simplified, oversimplified primer on Bitcoin mining. Have a great day.